That's you too. All of you that have turned these back on, if you would turn them back off again, I would appreciate it greatly. Mr. Howard, would you like to, I have an opening statement. Never mind. Got an opening statement. After a big lunch in the cafeteria, it's hard to get back to the pace of all of this. Good afternoon and welcome to the public workshop on the revised draft tentative order for the general permit for stormwater discharges from small municipal separate storm sewer systems, at least MS4s. I'm Charlie Hoppen, Chair of the State Water Resources Control Board. Also present with me today are my board members who you just don't see, but she's here. Frances Spivey Weber, Felicia Marcus, Tam Doduk, and Stephen Moore. Executive Director Tom Howard and Chief Deputy Director John Bishop, who is ill. The Division of Water Quality, Christine Sotelo, Eric Bernstein, and Ali Dunn from the Office of Chief Counsel, Emil Wadwani. I think all of you have gone through the emergency evacuation procedures, but if you hear an alarm, please exit through the doors in the back of the room and down the stairs. This workshop is being held in accordance with a revised notice of public workshop dated November 30th, 2012 to receive input on the revised draft tentative order for the general permit for stormwater discharges from small municipal separate storm sewer systems. Participants are expected to limit their oral comments to the November 16th, 2012 revisions made to the revised draft Phase 2 small MS4 permit since May 21st, 2012, and are encouraged to summarize their written submissions. No new evidence may be submitted. Staff will not be providing written responses to oral statements made at the board workshop that were not previously timely submitted as written comments. To ensure a productive and efficient meeting in which all participants have an opportunity to participate, speaker card, please fill out a blue speaker card and give it to the clerk at the front of the room. If you're not sure you want to speak, fill out the card and mark it if necessary. The deadline for submittal of written comments was 12 o'clock noon on December 17th, 2012. The Water Board will not take action on this issue today. This workshop is being recorded. There will not be sworn testimony. I will call the speakers in the order I've received their blue cards. When you come to the podium, please state your name slowly and identify the organization you are representing, if any. We will have a staff presentation by Ali Dunn, followed by public comments. First Deputy Director of the Division of Water Quality, Vicki Whitney, will give an opening statement. Victoria, it's all yours.
Good afternoon, Chairman Hoppen and members of the board. Thank you for the introduction. For the hearing record, I'm Victoria Whitney, Deputy Director of Water Quality. I'd like to offer my own welcome to all of the participants at today's workshop on the Phase 2 Stormwater Permit, and to thank you all for your interest and participation in the development of this very important permit. Renewal of this permit, as the board members know, is a high priority activity for the Division of Water Quality, and staff has been working diligently to comply with all of the procedural requirements before we submit a final draft to the board for your consideration and hopefully adoption. This workshop is one of the major milestones in the development and adoption process. Our intent today is to provide the board and interested parties with information on staff's latest revisions to the draft permit and to hear comments from the stakeholders on those revisions. As you all know, the permit development process is an evolutionary one, especially for large statewide permits like the Phase 2 permit. When we put a statewide permit out for public review for the first time, we know that the permit will evolve and it will become more effective and complete as a result of the input that we receive from interested parties. We listen and we make the changes necessary to balance the protection of the environment with the needs, interests, and capabilities of the regulated community and to meet our own obligations under the Water Code and under the Federal Clean Water Act. You'll hear a little bit more about the revisions to the permit from Ali in a few minutes, but first I wanted to give you a little background or perspective on the changes that we've made in this version. Environmental regulation can be polarizing, and we at the water boards are often in the position of balancing competing interests balancing environmental protection with economic realities. Stormwater permitting activities at the State Water Board are governed by the Clean Water Act, state law, and or federal law, and by the State Porter-Cologne Water Quality Control Act. Under both federal and state law, the board must ensure that its permits are reducing the discharge of pollutants and protecting water quality. But the Clean Water Act also allows for the consideration of economic costs in determining what constitutes the maximum extent practicable standard that's in federal law. Similarly, Porter-Cologne recognizes that activities must be regulated to attain the highest water quality that is reasonable. So in making revisions to the permit, we've tried to achieve a reasonable balance between environmental protection and the resources and capabilities of the permittees. The changes we've made in this regard are guided by 3 criteria. First, we would like everyone to focus on cost-effective requirements. We want to make sure that we do the most that we can with the limited resources that are available both at the board and in the regulated community. Second is we want to focus on the requirements that produce the greatest water quality benefit. And third, we want to target the dischargers' efforts in the highest priority water bodies, and we've determined those to be areas of special biological significance and in watersheds that have TMDLs associated with them. Lastly, I want to point out that just because we've removed some requirements from a prior draft in this permit revision, it doesn't mean that we don't expect that we might bring those requirements back into the permit in the next permit cycle or during a permit reopener. This is an incremental permit, and we fully intend to review and revisit the efficacy of the permit and the appropriateness of the conditions and incorporate revisions at the appropriate time. We will now have a presentation by representatives of CASQA, although you're going first, aren't you?
Yeah, sorry.
By Allie, followed by representatives of CASQA, and then Region 3 staff, and then lastly a joint presentation by Heal the Bay and the Natural Resources Defense Council. I'd like to thank everyone again for attending this workshop. Please don't hesitate to contact me or DWQ's stormwater staff if you have any questions.
Why is Region 3 going after CASCA?
Pardon me?
Why is Region 3 presenting after CASCA?
I don't know. That's a good question.
No
Want them to go
reason.
first?
They could go first if.
I mean, they are part of the water boards.
Sure.
Sure. I'll go first. Okay. Hi, everyone. Chair Hoppin, members of the board, Allie Dunn, environmental scientist with the Division of Water Quality Municipal Stormwater Unit. I'll be speaking on behalf of the Phase 2 permit writing team today and discussing the general permit. So just a quick overview of what I'll be discussing. I'll go over the permit schedule, briefly touch on the stakeholder process and the outcomes, talk about the revisions that we made to the second draft, and then summarize the written comments that were received, the more significant comments received. So this first draft was released in June of 2011. We then held stakeholder meetings November of 2011 through April of 2012. The second draft was then released in May of 2012, which reflected changes based on comments received in those stakeholder meetings. We then embarked on this staff workshops throughout the state in the month of June of 2012. And then board hearing was held August of 2012. Third draft just released in November, which reflected comments received on the second draft and comments received at the board hearing. Here we are today at our workshop and the adoption meeting scheduled for February. How do I do my little, hang on. Okay, there it is. Ta-da! So, as you know, staff worked with stakeholders to come up with this statewide foundation for stormwater regulations for Phase 2s. And in order to do that, we collaborated with regional boards, with small MS4s, traditionals, non-traditionals, and NGOs. And in those meetings, we addressed these key issues and concerns with the goal of balancing water quality and cost effectiveness and walking that fine line. So as Vicki touched on, we have these 3 goals in mind as we made the revisions. First of which was to focus on the most significant water quality issues. So for example, post-construction, as California's population is expected to increase, development increases, and that pressure on our receiving water bodies increases. We want to focus our efforts in post-construction. Second, we wanted to focus on cost-effective requirements, so returning to post-construction. Low-impact development is a cost-effective requirement to address post-construction. And then lastly, we target these high-priority water bodies, so areas of special biological significance and water bodies listed for TMDLs. So with that in mind, we went back to the drawing boards and made revisions to the second draft, first of which we focused on annual reporting. We streamlined reporting so that it just focuses on certification of if you completed these tasks that are required. And then also folks are required to submit a description or discussion of program effectiveness with those tasks completed. Post-construction, we have a permit reopener at the second year to bring back in hydromod and runoff retention criteria once staff has done this watershed analysis, if you will. We also included, for the Central Coast folks, the post-construction requirements as an attachment. Monitoring, generally the same content, but there's a lot of formatting and clarification there. We also emphasized regional monitoring in this third draft. And then lastly, within program effectiveness, we deleted the pollutant load quantification. Okay. So just a quick summary there of the comments received based on those revisions that we made. I won't read them off, everyone can see them there. Receiving water limitations, as you know, there's a workshop held in November of last year to address this issue, if you will. We included a reopener clause in this third draft, so if the board does decide to take action on it at some point, we can make those revisions. However, for now, we're moving forward. On the one hand, the comments permittees would like to see some resolution prior to adoption, and then on the other hand, NGOs would like to see it stay exactly as is with no action taken. So the next issue then with continued program implementation, we didn't, so this was in the second draft, however in this third draft we specified the procedure by which a regional board could say, hey, we'd like you to continue on with your current implementation of your BMPs. I think the issue here is more a matter of regional board discretion. So permittees have commented that it should be in the permittees' hands to move forward with their programs rather than regional boards. However, regional boards really have that regional knowledge and expertise of these programs and should have that authority to tap them and say, we'd like you to continue on. Next, the post-construction requirements then. So as we made these revisions, we had these 2 goals in mind. One was to develop low-impact development-based site design and water quality design criteria, which we worked very closely with the stakeholder groups to come up with this language, and that's what you see in section E12 now. And we don't have any intention to change that. We're happy with where we've come to there. The second part of this is to develop this hydromod and runoff retention criteria, which is based on dominant watershed processes and the sensitivity of receiving waters. This will be done through a public process, and at year 2, we'll have a permit reopener to integrate and incorporate those requirements. The other part of that then is we have Central Coast folks. Central Coast Region 3 has already established this watershed-based criteria, and as such, we want to move forward with that and kind of take what they've done as the framework to apply that process of looking at these watershed management zones statewide. The last of which then, monitoring. Again, no substantial changes really. It's still the same prioritization where if you discharge to ASBS or TMDL, you do that specific monitoring. However, if neither of those apply, we have a population threshold of 50,000, and then there's flexibility there for folks to implement different monitoring schemes. Regional monitoring was emphasized, whereby if there's a regional monitoring program in place, we want folks to try to encourage them to do a regional monitoring program as well. And in that way, they can share costs and share data and information on a larger scale. We received comments that the monitoring isn't far-reaching enough, it doesn't look at enough constituents. However, for a lot of folks, this is the first time that they're conducting monitoring phase 2s. And so it's really creating the strong platform or foundation by which folks can move forward and build these strong programs. And then lastly, TMDLs. We had a 6-month consultation period where regional boards, state board, and permittees would work together to come up with specific implementable language. We've extended that to a year. There are some cases where the regional board language is really just the waste load allocations, and it's not, if a permittee looks at it, it needs to be more specific so they know what to do with that waste load allocation. So in that year-long process, we'll reincorporate those specific requirements or permit reopener. And with that, I believe I'm done. Yeah. That's it. Can I turn it over to Region 3?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. I'm Michael Thomas, the Assistant Executive Officer for the Central Coast Water Board. Our chairman, Jeffrey Young, could not be here today, but he asked me to read a statement to you on this item. So Mr. Young, his statement starts with, I greatly appreciate the State Board's ongoing efforts to improve the stormwater regulatory program in California and acknowledge the huge challenge this
I'm sorry,
presents.
Michael, could you get a little bit closer to the microphone? Thank you.
Sure. And acknowledge the huge challenge that this presents to you and your staff. I want to assure the State Board that the Central Coast Board is also committed to improving the stormwater program. Our main purpose in commenting today is to urge you to preserve Region 3's post-construction requirements and other stormwater management program components that protect watershed processes and target water quality problems. The draft permit, as currently written, does this, and we support that draft. In our process to develop, consider, and adopt our post-construction requirements, we used a comprehensive stakeholder process and an independent scientific team to help us. The requirements we adopted are reasonable and are based on sound judgment and expertise. And most importantly, they are flexible. We listened to the many stakeholders involved and adjusted the requirements to make sure they were flexible. We included options for municipalities to use when the basic requirements are not applicable at a particular site. We also included the option for municipalities to propose implementation of their existing post-construction programs if they can demonstrate that their existing programs are as effective as our post-construction requirements. As a result, just last week, we approved the City of Santa Barbara's existing program, and we conditionally approved the City of Lompoc's existing program. These existing programs will be implemented in lieu of the requirements we adopted. We commend the cities of Santa Barbara and Lompoc for the hard work they have done to create their existing programs. We also have an ongoing stakeholder process for the purpose of effectively implementing the requirements. Many practical and technical issues can be resolved in implementation rather than through board hearing processes. Effective implementation is an ongoing iterative process where we consider feedback from stakeholders and adjust as necessary. The approach we are using is reasonable and it's necessary to protect beneficial uses. That concludes his statement. So now I'll hand it over to Dominic Rock, who is our lead person on implementing, one of the lead people in our office on implementing the program.
Thank you all very much for the opportunity to speak to you today and for the little bit extra time you've also given us. Our main purpose today in commenting is to urge you to preserve aspects of the phase of the draft permit that allow us to maintain levels of implementation and beneficial use protection we've achieved with the Phase 2 program. Your staff has acknowledged our progress with the Phase 2 program and has included language in the draft permit that allows us to maintain the progress that we've achieved where appropriate. There are two main sections of the draft permit that address this issue. Attachment J, which is sometimes called the Central Coast Joint Effort Requirements after the collaborative process we used to develop them. And Section E1B, which allows regional boards to require municipalities to continue implementing established programs that are more rigorous than the draft permit minimum requirements. We strongly support these sections and urge the State Board to adopt the draft permit with these sections included. First, regarding Attachment J, after a lengthy process initiated by the State Board's adoption of the general permit in 2003, the Central Coast Phase 2 communities are now poised to move forward with implementing post-construction requirements for stormwater management. That is why our board unanimously approved the requirements on September 6th of 2012. And it's important and it is reasonable to prevent further delay in implementing post-construction requirements in light of the 9 years that have passed since the first general permit was adopted and the substantial progress that's been made in the Phase 1 communities, which include several smaller communities comparable in size to our Phase 2s. In our own region, from 2003 to 2008, we observed poor progress toward the goal of developing meaningful, measurable post-construction requirements. The primary reason for this was the lack of specificity in the current permit's requirements. So in 2008, we conveyed our specific expectations around that goal to our communities. We established a timeline for them to develop requirements, and we identified default requirements that would go into effect if they didn't do so. Now, these default requirements were actually taken or borrowed from other Phase 1 permits around the state, so they were things that people had seen and used before. Our Phase 2 communities, however, rejected the default requirements, and they asked for more time to develop better requirements that really fit the region. So we engaged them in the joint effort to develop regionally appropriate requirements. In September of 2013, 5 years since we set out, and a full decade since the general permit was adopted, they will begin implementing post-construction requirements. Our process for developing our region's construction requirements is built on a solid foundation of stakeholder involvement and scientific assessment. Throughout, we have engaged the Central Coast stakeholder community, reviewed the science, and addressed the issues. The result is a better set of requirements. This process has not been pursued in other Phase 2 communities in other regions. This board saw the prospect of the Central Coast Phase 2s moving forward, and you approved a $600,000 allotment from the cleanup and abatement account to fund the scientific assessment that really is the underpinning of the joint effort. And as a result, the Central Coast communities are now prepared to implement post-construction requirements while many other Phase 2s in the rest of the state are not. But some are asking you to really throw out the joint effort and replace it with the draft permits minimum standard that wouldn't go into effect until 2015. 12 years after the first permit was adopted, 7 years after Region 3 made post-construction requirements a priority, and 2 years after Central Coast communities would otherwise be implementing post-construction requirements. Now, to respond to some of the technical issues that have been raised, The use of a 95th percentile rainfall statistic has received much attention. And for you to fairly consider the comments you will hear, and perhaps some you've read, we want to briefly review why we require it, where we require it, and how we require it. The 95th percentile criterion is invoked for retaining runoff, not for treating runoff. We use it as a surrogate for the pre-development hydrologic response to rainfall in locations where infiltration and subsurface flow are the dominant hydrologic processes. For example, even in small rain events, or rather even the smallest rain events will generate runoff on steep slopes and bedrock. But, if I can get this to advance, there we go. On a flat site, underlain by a groundwater basin in geologically young alluvial sedimentary rock and covered with vegetation, runoff is not generally an observable phenomenon, except under rare, low-frequency, very large rain events. It is this pre-development condition that we know supports intact watershed processes, and the environmental benefit of maintaining those processes, where possible, is the support of beneficial uses in the Central Coast region, including groundwater, from which we derive about 80% of our water supply. So the technical work conducted for the joint effort amassed substantial empirical evidence to identify the dominant watershed processes in the Central Coast region. The resulting stratification of our region, our regional landscape, it then allowed us to align the appropriate retention requirements to the landscape conditions. So this gets at where we apply the 95th percentile criterion. It is only for locations where the processes of infiltration and subsurface flow are dominant. The joint effort approach of assigning retention objectives based on watershed characteristics results in some areas pursuing a 95th percentile, some an 85th percentile, and some no retention at all. Rather than a leapfrogging over standards used in other permits, we find this to be a strategy to more accurately address the underlying watershed processes that are impacted by urban runoff. Now, how we apply the 95th percentile is also something I wanted to bring up. As with any basic criterion, we provide alternatives for the various impediments to its unconditional application, but we also recognize the greatest potential water quality benefit from post-construction stormwater management will be the new development, in the new development context, where watershed processes tend to be less impacted than in those redevelopment contexts or urban environments. We've made adjustments that have the same effect as lowering the 95th percentile criterion in those urbanized areas. So how we apply the criterion really ensures that it's being applied where it matters most to water quality. Commenters have stated that the joint effort retention facility sizing criteria is outdated and is incorrectly applied. First, the sizing criteria described as outdated is actually the same criteria cited in the draft permit and in every other Phase 1 permit in the state. It is an event-based approach to sizing facilities for projects that are too small to justify the expense of a continuous simulation modeling exercise. And it is conservative, as it should be, because it will be applied throughout a wide variety of soil and rainfall conditions around our region. Nevertheless, it is the only sizing method that we provided in the post-construction requirements, and we do recognize that there are alternative methods to sizing facilities to achieve the retention requirement, and we're prepared to evaluate those. A subcommittee of our main stakeholder group is already working on alternatives, and to that end, our recent comment letter to the board recommends a simple modification to attachment J that would allow the regional board executive officer to approve those alternatives when they're developed. It's been stated that the joint effort requirements are the most stringent and complex in the state. I should point out that our requirements include many opportunities for partial and alternative compliance that the Central Coast Water Board approved as appropriate for our projects in our region. These requirements are responsive to stakeholders' interest in a wide range of issues reflecting a variety of development scenarios. So there's no argument that at the end of the day, you've got more words on the page and more branches in your flow chart. But you've got implementable requirements with specific and enforceable language. Since the regional board adopted them in September, staff has developed guidance materials and hosted outreach meetings throughout the Central Coast to provide training to both municipalities, permittees, and to the designer and engineering community that will support implementation. So we've endeavored to construct a comprehensive process relying on stakeholders and technical experts so that the resulting requirements are based on sound judgment and expertise. We've listened and adjusted the requirements to achieve the right balance of reasonableness and flexibility, and we have a stakeholder process moving forward to improve the requirements and their implementation. This is a starting point which begins implementation of meaningful post-construction requirements on Phase 2 communities in our region to protect beneficial uses impacted by urban runoff. Now, I wanted to briefly discuss Section E1B of the draft permit. This provision provides the draft permit with the right balance between consistency and flexibility in our mind. The permit ensures municipal consistency by establishing minimum requirements for all municipalities, but also provides flexibility by defining a process for regional water boards and municipalities to follow to continue implementation of existing programs. Allowance for continued implementation has important implications for water quality. Many municipalities in our region are currently implementing aspects of their programs at levels higher than that required by the draft permit language. Reduction in those levels of implementation will likely result in increased pollutant discharges. Flexibility to continue implementation is also necessary to stay in accordance with the iterative and evolving implementation, or rather evolving nature of maximum extent practicable standards. The requirements allowing continued implementation do not lead to unfairness or unjustifiable differences in programs. Some differences between programs are to be expected, and they're appropriate due to the different municipal conditions encountered. In fact, program differences are likely necessary to protect beneficial uses and to meet the MEP standard. Central Coast Water Board staff urges you to adopt the Phase 2 permit with the provisions that allow for continued implementation of program elements where appropriate, and with minor revisions to Attachment J, allowing us to continue alternative methods identify alternative methods to sizing facilities for retaining stormwater runoff. Now, Dr. Derek Booth is here today. He's an engineer and a geologist, and he's a national expert on the effects of urban stormwater on watersheds. He was one of the authors of the National Academy Report on Urban Stormwater Management in the United States, and he was the principal author of the Central Coast Water Board's watershed characterization. I wanted to give him the last couple of minutes of our time allotment to say a few words about the concept of assessing watershed processes as the basis for selecting performance requirements for managing urban stormwater. Derek?
Thank you very much, and I promise to be brief. For the record, I am Derek Booth. I'm the senior geologist at Stillwater Sciences and a professor at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UCSB. Really just to emphasize some of the key points that Dominic made, the foundation of this approach is basically to recognize how our watersheds work and to maintain those functions. These watershed processes are what really determine the conditions and support the beneficial uses of receiving waters. If you impair those critical watershed processes, then you will impair the receiving waters. It's really as simple as that. To be clear, there is a voluminous scientific literature that supports this approach. We didn't just make this up. But we did spend a great deal of time in the field observing conditions there and confirming this framework, and also recognizing the differences from one place to another on the ground. The landscape, certainly in Region 3 as well as across the state, is not uniform. But if stormwater requirements are uniform, then either first they will be in some places overly conservative and unnecessarily restrictive, or conversely, in other places they will be inadequate to protect beneficial uses. In summary, the foundation of this approach is scientific-based and observationally confirmed, and it recognizes the realities of both the similarities and the differences between watersheds and receiving waters of the region. And certainly I can go on for much longer, but I will stop there and be happy to answer any questions or respond to any clarifications. Thank you.
I assume that the entire panel is going to be around for the whole workshop, so why don't we wait and we can ask more questions, or I will ask more questions later.
Ellie, are you or Vicki going to call up your next paneler?
I'll speak to this. Representatives from Casqua, Rebecca?
Need a clicker?
Yes.
Let me see, I think I just scroll. Yeah. Just scroll? Yeah. Hello. I'm going to be brief. There are really just 3 issues that we want to focus on, and the first 2 I just want to touch on, and then we really do want to talk about the Central Coast post-construction requirements. Oh, I should introduce myself. I'm Rebecca Weiner-Skenov. I work for Larry Walker Associates, but I'm also the lead of CASQUA's Phase 2 subcommittee, and I serve on CASQUA's board of directors, so I'm here today representing CASQUA. And so just to kind of jump into things, there are 3 issues we'd like to talk about. Receiving water limitations, regional board discretion, and the Central Coast post-construction requirements. So just to kind of be brief on this, this is in our comment letter that we submitted. So as you know, there is new language in the draft permit regarding a reopener to potentially revise the language depending on future decision by the board. And we want to just kind of make the suggestion that enough information was gathered at the November 20th workshop. We think that we can move forward with some revised language and include that in the final version of this permit. And CASQUA, as always, offers our help and assistance in moving that language forward. The next one is about regional board discretion, specifically, though, on the dispute resolution that's included in Provision H of the draft permit. And we feel that this is more of a reaction-based approach. Instead, we'd kind of ask for one that's a little bit more proactive instead of one that engenders, or potentially engenders, conflict. And we did make a suggestion to have one more that's a process that's a little bit more, it's request-based in terms of the discretion. But really, I want to make the recommendation that we work to revise this language, work on this language, and CASQUA, again, is happy to work with the staff on revising this language so it's not dispute-based. Instead, we can maybe get ahead of the disputes and make something that's a little bit more collaborative when it comes to areas of discretion. So I guess maybe just off the bat, I want to just clarify some things about what we're going to say about the Central Coast post-construction requirements. And to just maybe off the bat say that I would like to set the watershed management process or the general concept of that aside, because that's not what CASQA wants to talk about or dispute in any sort of way. You know, we kind of see that that's the way that things are headed and the way things are being done in other municipalities, particularly as it applies to hydromodification. Instead, our concerns are more oriented around the process and some of the technical aspects associated with Attachment D, specifically of the Central Coast requirements. So we do acknowledge that the Central Coast joint effort was developed by a team of technical experts. You know, it resulted in these watershed management zones, and that this was an effort funded by the state. But the design, or rather it's really the sizing criteria in Attachment D was done after the public review process had completed. And so there hasn't been an opportunity for those Central Coast municipalities to weigh in on the Attachment D sizing criteria to date. And so then looking at it from a statewide perspective, the fact and the process of it being included as a wholesale attachment within the Phase 2 permit is a little disconcerting because we're not exactly entirely sure what that means then statewide, or the precedent that it potentially sets for the rest of the municipalities statewide. And this is in part due to this little footnote in the fact sheet, but we feel like we need to take it, you know, pretty seriously, and as if this criteria could potentially be adopted, you know, for the rest of the municipalities in the state in the future. So with that, I'm going to turn over the rest of this presentation to Lisa Austin. She also serves on the board of directors for CASQA, and she's going to touch on some of the other technical and process aspects of the post-construction requirements.
Thanks, Rebecca. Good afternoon. As Rebecca said, my name is Lisa Austin.
Yeah, maybe would you center up on that microphone? There you go.
Does that help? Oh, thanks. Sorry. My name is Lisa Austin. I'm a senior water resources engineer with Geosyntec Consultants of 22 years of experience, and also serve on the board of directors for CASQA. Our comments related to the Central Coast post-construction requirements, or Attachment J of the draft Phase 2 permit, are related to 4 main points: process, inconsistency, the untested nature of the adopted standards, and the confusing nature of the requirements. So starting with process, our issues related to the process of adoption of the Central Coast standards as a part of the Phase 2 permit start with first that the adoption of the permit's Attachment J would nullify the existing Region 3 permittee petitions filed with the state, and this would deny the petitioners their due process rights. Secondly, we believe that there would be no value added by adopting the Central Coast requirements as part of the Phase 2 permit, and that these requirements could be implemented without doing that. Additionally, if these same types of requirements are adopted for other areas in the state in the future, that there might not be adequate time for review or notice. So regarding inconsistency, we have major concerns with the inconsistencies that are proposed by the adoption of the permit with Attachment J. 3 sets of standards would have been adopted by the state with this adoption, beginning with the post-construction requirements of the construction general permit, which currently apply to all Phase 2 jurisdictions that have not adopted a hydromodification control plan in the state. We have a different LID-based standard proposed in Section E12 of the draft Phase 2 permit. And now with the adoption of Appendix J of the draft permit, that introduces a 3rd set of requirements for the Central Coast permittees. We definitely support the E12 standards as they present a straightforward approach to implementation for this round of the Phase 2 permit. The Central Coast standards in Appendix J have many variations and off-ramps, which may be subject to creative interpretation and might not provide little assurance regarding the exact type of stormwater management that you're going to get on a site-to-site basis. For example, this slide presents 3 different examples of inconsistencies. between E12, Section E12, which would apply everywhere but the Central Coast, Phase 2 jurisdictions, and the Central Coast. So in E12, there's just 2 tiers of project thresholds, small projects and large projects, pretty straightforward. Central Coast Attachment J has 4 tiers. The sizing criteria in E12 is a very straightforward 85th percentile storm event. A retention of that, or 4% of the impervious area of a project, can be used as a rule of thumb. Very easy to implement and straightforward. The Central Coast Attachment J, on the other hand, has a multitude of standards from the 85th, 95th, plus a multiplier unless it's infeasible, and then you do 2% of EISA, don't ask me what that is, it's some kind of multiplication of impervious area. And then if you're in the 4th tier, you have to add peak flow control on top of that. So definitely not straightforward in anybody's mind. And then there's some inconsistencies actually in simple things like the BMP design specifications for bioretention. There's a different planning media depth in E12 than Attachment J. And there's different hierarchy of BMP types. Some areas have to just infiltrate, some areas can harvest, and some can't. Okay. What this slide is showing you is a comparison of the different sizing standards in E12 versus Attachment J. So this blue box on the outside represents a 1 acre impervious area. And what we did was we sized a standard bioretention facility for E12 standard. That's 4% of impervious. That's the green box in the right corner. Then as the boxes go out, that represents the different standards in Attachment J. So you have the 85th percentile. You have the 10% if you can show infeasibility. Then you have the 85th percentile with the multiplication factor, and then the 95th percentile with the multiplication factor, which is that large blue box, which is showing you that it's more than a quarter of an impervious acre would have to be dedicated to a bioretention facility to meet that standard. So it's not a simple, straightforward thing. The concern we have is that the retention of the 95th percentile standard with this multiplication factor that's in Attachment D of Attachment J is really untested. The technical basis is inconsistent with the current science in hydromodification management, which is actually written in a 2012 hydromod management guidance document that was sponsored by the state. There's no justification for the significant increase in space requirements and the cost from going from that 4% to that 10% to actually, as much as 26 to 28% of a site. Similarly, there's no justification for having requirements that are separate or greater than the E12 requirements, and that the permit does the requirements do allow the Central Coast permittees to develop their own sizing methods. But there's complications in that. Equivalency in the regional board approval is required to do that. So the underlying statement of the Central Coast joint effort is to maintain watershed processes such as overland flow, infiltration, base flow, and sediment transport, which we as CASCA members completely agree with. What we're questioning is whether the standards as adopted in Appendix J actually achieve that. We did a simple continuous simulation model on that 1 acre 1 acre impervious area to examine the effects of the different criteria. What we found, there was absolutely no performance gain in retention or surface water runoff control from going from 18 inches of media to 24, and that more runoff is captured and retained with the Appendix J standard, even just maximized at 10%, not going to the 26 to 28, than in the undeveloped condition. And this slide that we have here is a graph showing the results of that continuous simulation modeling. So basically the green line is the pre-development condition, the blue line is the post-development with an Appendix J size bioretention facility, but only at 10% of the project site. What that that blue line, what you want to do in hydromodification control is to get that blue line as close to the green line, but on the left side of it like it is. So it's showing you that that 10% standard actually is achieving flow duration control, although there's some separation of the lines, so that means it's over controlling the surface flows. If we had run this with a BMP that was sized to 28% of the project site, that blue line would be way to the left, and it just goes to show that the standard as written is excessive. It would overly control flows and not mimic the pre-development hydrology, which is what its intention is to do.
I'm sorry, go back.
Yeah.
So do you have a graph showing the other conditions?
No, the 28%, we did not. It was, we felt that even though I believe the way the standards are written, you have to show infeasibility to maximize your BMP site at 10%, but honestly, there's been a lot of discussion in the Phase 2 committee on this because it's confusing to me, and I've been doing this for a long time as to when you have to go to 28% and when it can be maximized at 10. So we just ran the 10%. We did not run the larger size BMP.
Is it possible for you to run that? Actually, I can't ask that
Absolutely.
because they can't submit any more additional information.
Yeah, it is possible for us to do that.
Okay.
Okay. So the last point we just wanted to make is confusing. And as I said, I work on a lot of regulatory interpretation and implementation of hydromodification control standards, and I found it very confusing to try to figure out what the deal is. There's multiple tiers, sizing standards, and off-ramps. It will lead to creative interpretation and uncertainty. Different design requirements apply to different size projects, different management zones. It requires redevelopment projects outside of an approved urban sustainability area to multiply replaced impervious surface by 0.5. That's just an example of one of the embedded criteria. And when does the 10% sizing maximum apply? I'm not sure. So our recommendations is from the CASCA, is that, you know, E12 was developed over a 2-year period with general agreement among stakeholders. It's easy to interpret, and it's implementable. We would suggest that you delete all references to the Central Coast post-construction requirements in Attachment J in the Phase 2 permit. Allow us one cycle to implement E12 and learn from that. And during this time, thoughtfully work out how watershed management zones should be incorporated into post-construction standards in the next permit term in a technically correct and implementable manner. That's it. I do have a slide that illustrates bioretention. If you're interested, I can go through that. I'm not sure how much. Oh, I think I'm over time.
Actually, I would like to see.
Oh, okay. So this is a bioretention facility as per illustrating provision E12. Basically what you have is a plant that you have a 6-inch ponding depth with plants on it. You have a soil media. Here, I think that's, okay, so that's sized, the surface area is sized approximately 4% of its impervious tributary area. You have a 6-inch reservoir or a ponding depth on top of the 18 inches of a sand and compost growing media, and a 12-inch gravel layer under that. And if you have good infiltrating soils, that's what a bioretention facility would be. You have an open bottom. If you have lower infiltrating soils, then you have an underdrain at the top of the gravel layer, and what that does is it requires the water to go, oh good, this is great, it goes, fills up, it goes down through the filter. It acts as a filter, and the gravel stores the water, infiltrates, and as the soil allows, you get evapotranspiration through the plant,